Welcome to today's ECI Live webinar on addressing ethics and compliance challenges for multinational organizations. My name is Dan Waltman, and I'm the Vice President of Member Engagement at ECI. We are delighted to have today's panel, who not only represent the ECI working group that produced the white paper on this topic, but also represent a multitude of industries and who are quite literally sitting in 4 different countries around the globe. Just a little background on ECI working groups. Working groups are member-led initiatives who typically meet monthly over the course of 6 to 12 months to study a single issue or topic that is important to the ethics and compliance profession and workplaces worldwide. Participating in working groups includes conducting independent research, collaboration, networking, and the publication of a white paper and other resources, such as today's webinar. At the conclusion of today's webinar, this white paper will be made available to you, as well as information on how to participate in an upcoming working group that is currently forming. So without any further ado, let me turn it over to Valerie Halliburton, Vice President, Ethics and Compliance at Colgate-Palmolive. Over to you, Valerie.
Mute, Valerie. Sorry.
My apologies. Can everyone hear me now? All right, I'll go ahead and I'll start over again. Thank you so much. So first of all, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Valerie Halliburton, as Dan indicated. I was so excited at the opportunity to participate in this event today. In preparation for our session today, it gave me a chance to really think back to the beginning of this project. I have to admit that my initial interest in participating with this working group was purely selfish. I actually work for a US-based multinational. Our ethics and compliance function was put in place back in 2008. And since that time, I've had the opportunity to watch our program evolve from its very infancy to now, where it's become a mature, established program. Did we get everything right along the way? No, we didn't. But this was an opportunity for us to go through our own experiential learning. And also, we've always strived to learn from other external organizations who've gone through a similar evolution. So one of the key attractions for me in terms of my participation in this working group was the sheer diversity, the opportunity to interact with people from different industries who have a different organizational design, a different organizational size, etc. So all of this helped me to realize the value of my participation. But because of that diversity, because of the differences in terms of industry and the org design and all of that, it helped us as a team realize from the very start of this project just how expansive the scope could be. So it was important for us just to start from a common framework. So in this particular case, we wanted to start by looking at what are the unique risks and challenges that all multinationals face. We identified a number of risks, and I'd like to talk about those. First of all, being multinational organizations, of course, we're going to have geographically diverse or geographically dispersed workforces. Colgate, for example, we have almost 35,000 employees, but we have operations in more than 200 countries. Also, varied channels of business. Again, if you look at the members of the panel, we all come from very different industries and utilize different business models. But that's not just unique to the panel or the other participants in our particular working group. Also, again, I'll use Colgate as an example. We have 5 different categories of business: oral care, personal care, home care, pet nutrition, skin health. And within those categories, different business models. And so there are challenges that result, as a result of that. Because we have geographically dispersed workforces, we also have a diversity of internal and external cultures, as well as languages that can pose a challenge. And then in each country, there are going to be regulatory agencies. There will also be government officials, government entities that our businesses have to deal with and they have to address. So we started off knowing that we have these common risks and challenges. But then, in order, again, to keep us focused in what could be a very broad-based project, we wanted to put together kind of a roadmap, or I'll use the term rationale. And this is the areas that we would want to focus on that would become the byproduct of our working group. So our goal was to identify best practices for maintaining an effective ethics and compliance program, focusing on those cultural considerations. Again, that was one of the challenges that we identified early on. How do we demonstrate leadership? What is the best mode to communicate? How do we provide effective training? Also, in identifying any gaps in the process, risk assessments, internal controls, program integration and alignment. Ethics and compliance is not an island. We have to work with other functions in order to be effective, whether that be human resources, legal, corporate audit. We work together in order to be effective. And then finally, I keep mentioning the word effective, but one of the other important components are program metrics. We won't know that our programs are effective unless we have a way of measuring effectiveness. So at this point, we're going to do a deep dive into each of those elements of the rationale. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Sean, and she'll take us through the next portion of the presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Valerie. I hope everybody can hear me. Yeah, hello from France. So my name's Sean. I work for the Aix-Marseille University. I teach business ethics and intercultural management, and I was really happy to be able to work with this team on this white paper and to exchange our points of views. And it's also very good for me to get out of academia and see what's going on in the real world. I was lucky enough to have professional experience in international organizations where I, for example, had to explain the different codes of conducts of different organizations to their new recruits during the onboarding sessions. So for me, cultural considerations are vital in addressing challenges in ethics and compliances in multinationals. What I want to go into right now is to tell you what culture is for us in this context. It's basically a set of social norms and behaviors that define a group identity. We decided that there were 6 subgroups of cultures that we went into detail. And I'll start off with the first one, which is the supranational culture. What do I mean by supranational culture? I mean that some organizations today are so huge and so powerful that they can supersede national cultures in the sense that they can impose certain things that would not be necessarily agreed upon in certain nations. Supranational cultures are also the cultures of those that group together and reinforce their negotiation powers. And one of the most recent examples is, for example, the European Union. We can consider it as a supranational culture when it gives fines, huge fines, to a company like Google. Then we can go on to national cultures, which I'm most familiar with because I have worked with, I think, about 35 different nationalities. What I found most interesting is that generally, as an interculturalist, you're told about the differences in cultures, and I'd rather focus on the similarities. National cultures, if you look into core values, are basically similar. It's the interpretation of values that is more complicated. That is an area where you have to really expand your knowledge. And that's where you need somebody on the ground in the country concerned. Because from your office in London, Tokyo, Melbourne, New York, you're not necessarily going to know what's going on the ground. So you need what can be called a cultural ambassador. You need somebody who's a cultural linguistic expert in the field, who knows about your company and who also knows exactly what's going on in their own country. Let's say a facilitator. Then I'll go on to regional cultures. And these are cultures that I discovered through professional experience. Very often, and still nowadays, I find that we tend to be very lazy. And we like to say things like, when you do business with the Americans, these are the things you have to do. When you do business with the Chinese, these are the things you have to do. No, I'm sorry. It's much more complicated than that. The world is a lot more global. Social media has made new generations much more interculturally aware than my generation, for example. So regional cultures affect ethics and compliance programs in the sense that you might very well think you know a national culture, but basically if you're operating in a region of that nation that has a different approach or a different religion or a different language, I'm thinking of, for example, India, you have to know all about that region, how that region negotiates with other regions, how people consider each other, where they come from, their backgrounds. So that's regional. Then I'll go into corporate, which for me, corporate cultures are the simplest to understand. Why? Because they don't have centuries and centuries of history and of art and literature and language, etc. Corporate cultures are what bind people together in a company, in an organization. They are also the driving force behind motivation. And they are based on a set of values, like most cultures. Corporate cultures are, I would say, again, easy to understand, but you have to be very careful how you deal with corporate cultures. You have to make sure you understand them. Then I'll go on to generational, which for me has been the eye-opener in my job. Why? Because I teach students, Chinese students, American students, French students, all nationalities, and they're all of the same generation. They're all between let's say 23 to 30. And I find that they have a definite culture. And I don't think that's taken into account enough in today's world. I don't think that businesses realize how different the new generation is, how different the younger generations are from our generations. I think you have to be very open-minded. We're talking in the United States right now about the Great Resignation. Yes, probably due to the pandemic, but also due to the younger generation seeing work in a different way than older generations had seen it. So you have to be aware of this generational culture in your ethics and compliance programs. Also, because the younger generation is much more interested and involved in the values of different businesses. I have heard many times from students, undergraduate, graduate, that no, they will not apply to a job in this corporation or that corporation because they don't align with their values. So I think it's up to businesses to understand the newer generations and to also attract new talent by speaking the same languages and promoting the same values. And I'll go lastly into a professional culture. What I've noticed also in my professional experience was that I'll give you an example. I worked for an international organization called ITER. ITER is a huge project that is whose aim is to demonstrate the possibility of fusion power on Earth, fusion energy on Earth. So it's set up in the south of France. I think right now we've got about 3,000 to 4,000 people working on this. And what I realized is that the professional cultures were very, very important when trying to communicate. I noticed in meetings that if you were from an engineering background, or if you were a physicist, or if you were from HR or whatever, you communicated more easily with somebody in HR, but from a completely different culture. So engineers communicate more easily with other engineers, even though they're separated by half the world, because somewhere along the line, they speak the same language. So those are the 6 subgroups of culture that I worked on within the group. And I hope it was clear. And now I'd like you to answer a question. I'm going to launch a poll. If Alyssa could launch it for me, please. Let me see if I can launch it myself. Yes. Here we go. So my question here is, which of these six subcultures are you having the most issues with when rolling out your ethics and compliance programs? I hope everybody has access to it. Let me see the poll results here. So as a reminder, we've got supranational, national, regional, corporate, generational, and professional. If you'd like to submit your vote, that would give me a good idea of what you're dealing with. Okay, I don't seem to see the results of the poll. It doesn't matter. I hope I'll get them later. I will now let my colleague Stephen Pegg from Lockheed Martin talk to you about leadership, about communication and training. Stephen, it's yours.
Thanks, Sean. So I hope everyone can hear me. And hello from UK. So Sean there was speaking to you from France. I'm here in the UK, and I'm going to talk to you about the next topic that we covered in our white paper. But before that, I'll just briefly introduce myself. I'm the International Ethics Manager for Lockheed Martin, and that simply means that I and a small team look after the ethics program outside of the United States. Lockheed Martin being a US headquartered company with about 114,000 people worldwide. About half of those are engineers, and we operate in over 50 countries. So a bit like Valerie was saying earlier, you know, that in itself, when you operate in over 50 countries and 400 facilities and 5 different business areas, and half the population's engineers and scientists, you know, that can bring in some international cultural challenges, and you know, between domestic sites, between US, between international, and so on. So quite an interesting topic. So Sean expertly explained some of the cultural challenges faced by multinational organizations, and I'd like to now cover some of the leadership, communication, and training challenges that will influence culture. Okay, so let me just move the slide. Okay, so I'm going to start. I'm not going to start with a polling question. I'm going to do that in a minute. So let's think about leadership first. If we think about leadership and behaviors, so the behaviors and leadership, behaviors and actions of leadership directly influence the culture of an organization. Well, in my experience, leaders are typically held to a higher level of accountability than non-leaders. And their role is really to create an environment where employees feel comfortable speaking up to either them or maybe ethics or maybe HR about the concerns that they have. And also really to make sure in doing that, and it takes a lot of effort and, you know, bravery to speak up, that there's a zero tolerance for any retaliation that might follow. So employees are only going to speak up if they trust the leadership to treat their concerns seriously with confidentiality and that they won't be retaliated against. I think that's key. So how can leaders achieve this? They can partially achieve that trusting environment through their communications, you know, setting the tone. And you hear about this, setting the tone at the top and the middle and the lower levels. But it only works if that reaches all levels and locations in the organization. And more importantly, when leaders demonstrate what they're saying through their own actions and behaviors. That's especially key in the current environment when so many of our workforces are working alone from home without so much observed supervision as they might have had in the past. So leaders have needed to change their approach and trust employees to do the right thing when they're working on their own, as well as showing a bit more empathy and flexibility with employees as hybrid working really becomes the norm. And that's a challenge for some leaders. Leader visibility and transparency in messaging and decision making is really key, especially during crisis times like we've experienced over the last couple of years. So employee actions and behaviors are most influenced by what they hear and see from their immediate leader or supervisor. And studies have shown that, you know, with employee misconduct, it's 3 times more likely when their leader also exhibits misconduct. So it's not enough for a corporate headquarters to be ethically sound if other parts of the business are not. Leadership alone is definitely not enough, and having some strong internal controls, including accessible and current policies and processes, a code of conduct, and a well-advertised speak up and reporting line or whistleblowing program is key. Okay, so when we move on and think about communication, if leadership messages reflect company values and address some of the risks identified in your code of conduct, employees are going to know what's expected of them and also what's unacceptable. Now, with communication strategies, they could either be centralized, a top-down approach to ethics and compliance strategies, or they could be decentralized, disaggregated, if you like. And for global companies, I don't think one size really necessarily fits all in this regard. But whether it's centralized or decentralized, organizations' ethics and compliance communications need to be culturally and legally relevant to each region or country. So you need to consider things like different international employment law, privacy laws, corruption and other laws that might differ in different countries to where your company's headquartered, as well as ensuring that key points are not lost in any language translations. And that's really important. If you use a translator, use your local offices and your employees in those local countries to check the translation hasn't lost any keywords and meanings. So the risks of decentralized communications include inconsistency or maybe contradictory messaging across an organization, which can lead to confusion and some microcultures existing, as we heard earlier. And then if we think about training, so a key challenge for ethics and compliance training in multinational organizations is to make it relevant and memorable for each workforce. So I just wanted to share with you this forgetting curve that was interesting and developed by Herman Ebbinghaus, and shows that 50% of what you learn may be forgotten within an hour of taking that training, and 70% or more could be forgotten within 1 or 2 days. So a one-size-fits-all approach is unlikely to be effective across all areas of the business. When you think about the different types of workers that you have, production workers maybe with a little IT access, home workers, office workers, those working at remote or customer sites. And in addition, the most effective training needs to appeal to multiple generations, cultures and nationalities, as Sean was describing quite well earlier. So you're likely to need a different training approach for third parties as well, such as agents, consultants and intermediaries. I think what is important is a range of training methods and solutions might be required. And, that could be anything from short nudging training, just these very short messages, e-learning, use of apps, AI even, chatbots some companies are using, avatars, having a gamified approach to your training, making it a challenge and a competition, having leader-led either in-person or virtual case study-based training that tells stories. These are all different types of approaches that companies can use. So best practice would ensure that training is focused on changing the behaviors aligned to your company policies and laws, and to consider all the cultures and job roles that you have. So for example, an annual scenario-based ethics training could include international settings and characters and languages and subtitles to reinforce that it's globally relevant. Otherwise, it could be seen as being, well, that's fine for, say, a US headquartered or a European headquartered company, but what about us in the other countries? Compliance-based training could also be risk-based and targeted by job role, rather than everyone taking the same training. So, more training could be given to those most at risk of compliance issues, like procurement organizations and new business sales employees, for instance. So certainly when you're coming to develop your training, involving employees from different lines of the business and geographies will help to make it relevant and more accurate culturally for those other locations. So I think in summary, one size certainly doesn't fit all in this regard. Now, I did want to also, like Sean did, ask a polling question, and I'm going to see if I can launch that now. Okay. So the polling question should be up, if I could encourage you all to vote on this. And in terms of what percentage of communication would you say is non-verbal? So I've got a range of options there for you. If you could all have a go at launching that. And Alyssa, I'm assuming that poll is up for everybody. Okay, I can see the voting coming along. All right, so I'm just giving that 1 second to stabilize out. I don't know if everybody else can see the poll results. I can see them, but what we're seeing here is a marginal, top of the pile being between 75 and 90%. And then the next down was between 50 and 75%. They're almost very similar, 37%, 33% respectively. But what's actually quite interesting here, I'm just going to wind back a little bit here, is if there is such a thing as a correct answer, you know, the studies would show that actually it's higher than you've all really suggested here. That, you know, E would be the right answer here, you know, over 90%, if you like. So 93% of all communication is non-verbal. According to Dr. Albert Mehrabian's 7-38-55% rule, only 7% of communication and meanings via the spoken word. 38% is actually by voice and tone, such as variation in volume, emphasis, pauses, and then 55% is body language, so eye contact, facial expression, and lots of arm movement, like I tend to do. So, you know, having an awareness of that can have a big impact on how the communication is received. So is it sincere? Is it believed? Does the person communicating it have credibility themselves? Also, different cultures have different meanings of words, behaviors, and gestures. So some research really is recommended if you're going to be communicating into different countries and regions. So having a level of cultural understanding of the differences and beliefs is definitely a sign of respect, and will help foster some more effective communication. So at this point, I'd like to hand over to my colleague, Greg Keeling, who's going to talk to you about risk assessments, program integration, and metrics and reporting. So over to you, Greg. We're just waiting for Greg to join. He's just having a technical issue coming back on.
What would a presentation be without some technology issues? So thank you for that. Hopefully it's not going to persist. So thank you, everyone. So Sean has covered some cultural considerations, and Stephen has covered leadership, communication, and training. I am not going to spend the rest of the hour discussing the last 3 sections of the paper, but I do want to highlight them, and then we will move into some questions and answers. So please either put your questions in the question box or in the chat. My name is Greg Keeling. I'm Director of Ethics and Conduct for the BMO Financial Group, an international financial institution headquartered in Toronto with operations around the world. I'm going to start off by talking about risk assessments. Just move ahead here. Each of your organizations likely has a process for undertaking periodic risk assessments that are pertinent to your particular business. These will also evaluate internal controls. How aware are you of the level of the risk assessments? Are they done at a line of business level, at a geographic level, a legal entity level, or based on regulatory coverage? Are they aggregated or handled at the lowest level, practical? What risks are addressed in these assessments? Do you, in your practices, have line of sight into all the risks, or just the particular risk that you are concerned about? be that ethics, be that compliance? How well do you coordinate with other parts of the organization in doing these risk assessments, in reviewing the outcome of risk assessments, looking for issues that cross risk topics? And how frequently is the information updated? How do you keep this information up to date when considering changes in risk profiles? Some of the risks are going to be associated with controls managed at a global level, some at a regional level, some at a regulatory level, and some unique to particular lines of business or geographies. It's important to keep a robust non-financial risk taxonomy and control inventory in place to understand the implications. Routine monitoring and testing of controls, along with effectiveness assessments, are vital to demonstrate ongoing effectiveness of these programs. There's obviously lots more in the paper, but time does not permit us to dwell on risk assessments. In terms of program integration, a number of my colleagues have mentioned the fact that we do not operate alone. Multinational organizations have multitudes of oversight and governance functions working within them, especially if they are operating under unique jurisdictional or regulatory requirements. Firms may have operational or organizationally aligned E&C programs with legal or risk, HR, or a number of other overarching functions. The ethics programs may be aligned with HR. Compliance could be aligned with risk. Regardless, depending on the size and the complexity of an organization, a number of supporting functions may operate in full alignment with the E&C team under the same ultimate senior management or elsewhere within the company. How often do you work with your colleagues, or do you cover topics such as anti-bribery, anti-corruption, competition and antitrust, cyber and information security, fraud, investigations, customer complaints, non-financial risk management, privacy, sales practices, diversity and inclusion? How often does your organization deal with these topics that cover a multitude of concepts? Jumping ahead here. How do you have input into topics such as compensation and incentive policy? Do you have line of sight into all the topics that you feel are relevant, or just what's operationally within your purview? How often do you get involved with regulatory matters? How often do you find yourselves in meetings with multiple governance organizations and functions? How often do you meet with your colleagues to discuss matters of mutual interest? For example, did you invite a colleague to this webinar? And if not, why not? Lastly, we can't discuss ethics and compliance without discussing ESG, environmental, social, and governance. It's the topic that is dominating all the discussions these days. And how does your topic, how does your E&C program fit in within your larger ESG initiative? An effective E&C program requires input and insights from a diverse selection of stakeholders and oversight functions to operate effectively. Each of these groups must work together to develop points of integration with related functions. Lastly, I want to touch briefly on program integration and alignment with other or program metrics and reporting. It's possible we could have called this metrics if necessary, but not necessarily metrics. Metrics are required for analysis, for reporting, for context, for insight, but it's the narrative. It's what do you do with the metrics? How do you collect them? How do you analyze them? How do you aggregate them? How do you report on them? Who uses the metrics? For what purpose? Do you have multiple groups collecting similar metrics? Do you have access to the information that you need? Who reviews the data? Who reports on the data? Who utilizes the data? Who responds to the data? On this, I'm going to jump to a polling question that I think is quite pertinent. So if we can launch the last poll. I think it's just loading. Perhaps it's loading for you and not for me, given my earlier technical issues. With that, in short, I wanted to note that the importance of bringing these different groups together, having access to the information, sharing the information to be able to make informed decisions that are comprehensive and effective for the entire organization, again, depends on your perspective, depends on the realm that you are addressing. But it's important to understand what else is going on. So I'm not seeing the poll. Hopefully the poll is coming up. If not, we can turn back to it later. And I'm going to turn it back to Valerie for a wrap up of the key lessons learned and recommendations.
Thank you, Greg. Thank you, everyone. As I said at the beginning of the presentation, there were a number of areas that we wanted to focus on that were part of our rationale that we explored specifically as part of the working group. But what I want to share with you now are the key takeaways that came out of those particular areas. So first of all, you keep hearing me mention the word effective. So an effective ethics and compliance program, you have to be not only aware of cultural dynamics, but you have to take those cultural factors into consideration for your program. Leaders. Stephen talked about leadership. It's important that leaders demonstrate a commitment to ethics and also set the example. We talk a lot about tone at the top, and I think one of the important messages that we've shared with our employees is tone at the top doesn't begin and end at corporate headquarters. For those people that are working in the various locations around the world, their top, the tone that they're observing is there in that office, whether it be in Papua New Guinea, in Nairobi, in Sao Paulo. They're looking to you, leader, local leader, to set the example. Companies of all sizes need to undertake periodic risk assessments and also test and evaluate their internal controls. It's important to understand where there might be gaps in order for you to then put in place a mitigation solution, excuse me. Also, in terms of communications and training, we want our training, our communications to be effective. In order for them to be effective, they need to be focused. We need to think about multiple methods of delivery. And then finally, they need to be memorable. Any effective ethics and compliance program requires integration. A number of us have mentioned today that we're not an island, ethics and compliance. We don't act alone. So as part of your enterprise risk management, you will need to work with other functions, not only to ensure effectiveness of the program, but also effectiveness of sharing of data, as well as management of potential issues. And then finally, Greg just talked about metrics. In order for us to understand whether or not our programs are effective, we need to establish metrics. But the important component of this is one word, and that is consistency. So once the metrics are established, we need to consistently collect the data, review the data, and then use it to make strategic decisions. It's not a one and done. It's something that has to be done on a continual loop. So that is all that I have today. At this point, I'm going to turn it back over to Dan.
Thank you, Valerie. If we could have all the presenters come on back onto the screen. I know we have a few questions we wanted to answer. And by all means, please type your questions into the questions tab or the chat bar. We did have a question around communications. When does effective communication become excessive communication in a multinational company scope?
Shall I have a go at that and then see what others come up with? I mean, just thinking about that question, I would say from my experience as well, when that communication isn't relevant or doesn't, becomes not relevant, to regions, for instance, if you're in a multinational organization, if you had excessive corporate communications that didn't really resonate regionally, that might be seen to be, an issue. And also just the sheer bombardment of different types of communications that we have these days in corporate worlds. We have email, we have instant messaging, we have intranets, we have company social media channels like Slack. So I think it's really important to choose the timing of communications carefully, if you want people to take note of it, because as I say, they're going to filter out some of those messages. So, and what I'd say is also encourage your regional teams, and we certainly do, to localize ethics and compliance communications. So that it is relevant and in the right sort of language. And, a communication in Australia might look quite different to a communication in the Middle East, for instance. So other views might be different to me, but I'll throw it back to the rest of the group.
Sure, I'll be happy to say a few words on that. What's been key for us at Colgate is to work very closely with our corporate communications group. They've played a very vital role in terms of ensuring that, in terms of the timing of any messaging, that we're not launching something that will conflict with another department's message or communication strategy. That way we get the most eyes that we possibly can on, whatever particular message we're trying to deliver. In addition to that, we also look at our data analytics. So we do what's called quarterly learning burst, and we'll look to see how many eyes, how many people actually opened the message, how many people actually reviewed the information. We look at that to see if there's any seasonal impact, or, from a geographical perspective, what are we seeing? And it helps us to better plan out, future messaging. But one other thing that we talk about at Colgate, and I guess this is part of being a consumer products company, is it's not something that's one and done. We think of it almost like you would a commercial. You don't put a commercial out one time and expect people to remember the message from that commercial. So we will want to do look for multiple opportunities to, have a touch point with those employees to reinforce the message again and again and again. And we also do a specific ethics and compliance survey. And part of the survey is about communications and finding out, based on feedback from all of the employees, are we over communicating? And thus far, I think we've been very conservative in terms of our approach.
Thank you, Valerie. Sean, anything else to add?
No, I fully agree with what's been said by Stephen and Valerie. I think that the over communication is getting to be a bigger and bigger risk every day with all the media we have to use.
Thank you. We're glad to have Greg back again. We had another request for some examples of how local management can set the example in demonstrating true commitment to ethics and compliance. So any examples of how local management can set an example for ethics and compliance?
One thing, go ahead. Sorry.
No, go ahead, Stephen.
No, I was just going to say that storytelling is always good, and transparency as well in management. If management aren't transparent in messaging, I think that trust will be lost pretty quickly. And and if it's known that they are not demonstrating the behaviors that you're instilling in your employees, then again, those words just become hollow messages. So I think storytelling is a good one that one of the things we do is put some monthly case files, we call them, out, so that leadership can use those as examples of real events that have happened, suitably anonymized, of course, to explain, this is a scenario, this is the outcome of that scenario, and this is the sort of discipline and the issues that arose at all levels. So, storytelling, sort of walking the talk, if you like, and and communicating sincerely with with transparency.
No. Can I just add something to what you said, Stephen? I think that if you have sort of local mentors or local referees or local people who are looked up to transmit the message into the right language and into the right context, often it means, moving the message from one context to another to make it very relatable. I think that's important to have these crucial point people who are respected in the local community.
Thank you. Any other examples, thoughts?
I would just add that if you look at how decisions are made, are they consistent with your ethical principles? How do you reward and recognize people? Are they consistent with your ethical principles? And if you have a divergence between those, then you are going to have people who don't believe in the power of your program.
Good point. We had a follow-along question, excuse me, to that. When delivering your compliance messages, do you prefer sending them through compliance as a function, or through communications, or through management? What do you find most effective?
I would say a little bit of both. I think what was important for us, again, as our program evolved, initially, almost every ethics and compliance message came under the label of from ethics and compliance. So it was viewed as something that New York or headquarters was basically making us do. So as the program has evolved, it's become important for local leaders to take ownership of ethics and compliance. So part of the way we do that, I mentioned our ethics and compliance survey, for example. So we just did the survey for 2021 back in March. And basically, we have that information sliced and diced right down to the local level. And that feedback is actually given to the local leaders. They deliver those results to the local audience. They don't come from New York. They come from the local leadership team. And they, together with their teams, pull together a mitigation plan in terms of how they will address issues, whether that be issues related to speak up, whether that be issues related to intense business pressure and the possible impact that might have on compromising ethics. They own it, not headquarters. And so that has helped in terms of them feeling as if this is something that they own.
Just to add to to what Valerie just said there, one of the things we do is annual leader-led ethics training, and the reason it's leader-led rather than ethics-led is just that the leader can choose which scenarios are relevant to their team. They can make them culturally relevant. They can even translate them into local languages. So we provide all the material. The corporate team will provide the material and the cases and the videos and the scenarios and the leader guide, but the onus is very much on the leaders to deliver that training and choose and translate for their local team. I think that works quite well.
And I would just add to what Stephen was saying is that certain messages clearly come from ethics and compliance, but having the CEO, having the department head speak on these topics demonstrates that it's important to the entire company. It's just not important to one particular function of the company because they care about regulatory matters. Everyone needs to care about this, so it should be heard at all levels.
Fantastic. Any other thoughts? I don't see any additional questions in the chat, but please feel free to add them. I was just going to ask, as we kind of wrapped up, what was your biggest takeaway from participating in this working group, your aha moment or something new that you learned? If you could share with the with the audience.
I think as being the one working in a university and having had professional experience in business also, but I was very pleasantly surprised at how much work was being done on ethics and compliance. I mean, it's just I'm a true believer now that things are changing and that things are getting much better.
I would say actually having academic in the group is really helpful as well. You know, the way Sean described those different cultural groups and the fact that, you know, there is a focus sometimes on the differences, but actually, you know, the world's becoming much more aware of different cultures and perhaps some of those stereotypical views of how people dress, you know, the customs and the so on are perhaps changing. So, you know, really to really use your local teams a lot more and make sure you really understand culture, not what you perceive it to be or what some of the material you'll see on the internet suggests it will be.
Dan, I think there's a question that hasn't been answered in the chat.
Yeah, I just popped it in there around
Okay.
behavioral metrics. And that came up during Greg's presentation. When reviewing behavioral metrics, is it beneficial or detrimental to apply thresholds to rate the metric?
Yeah, this is something that we have worked on extensively. If anyone's interested, they can reach out to me and I can share a paper that Oliver Wyman came out with about 2 years ago, talking about metrics and thresholds and different types of metrics and different types of thresholds. We've also recently been doing work with the ORX, which is an international risk management group out of London, and we did a paper on risk indicators with them. It's way too complicated a topic to discuss in the next 2 minutes, but I think if you talk about key takeaways, one of the topics that is I think very relevant to all of us is the fact that we all need data. We all have complexities gathering data. It doesn't matter which industry we're in, which location we're in, which part of the organization we're in. We all have challenges collecting data, collecting the right data, aggregating the data, reporting on the data. So it is something that is near and dear, I think, to everyone here. The challenges are not getting easier, but it's something that is highly common to all of us.
Well, any other departing thoughts as we're heading towards the top of the hour?
I'll reinforce what Greg said. I mean, you know, we all learned from each other. It was actually a pleasure to sort of work on this working group and learn from, you know, banking industry and Colgate Palmolive, you know, sort of versus, you know, aerospace defense technology company and academia, you know. So I think that blend, it did show us, you know, there's quite a lot of similarities irrespective of the sector you're in, but also, you know, there's some nuances that I think we really learned from. So yeah, it was real pleasure working with the group.
Well, I wanted to thank all of you. I really appreciate your time and effort you put into the working group and today's presentation. So thank you, Valerie and Sean and Stephen and Greg. And I also wanted to thank the rest of the working group who are on the call today, who also contributed to the paper. As you're looking in your chat, we are in the process now of calling for the next round of participation in ECI working groups. And it's been posted in the chat. So if you're interested, please do so. Take a look by the end of by early next week. We'll be closing those down soon. And that's open to ECI members. Also, be sure to visit the ECI events page. There's more information about upcoming events. We have a best practice forum on the intersection of corporate compliance programs and the U.S. Department of Justice enforcement policies on December 15th. Also, in the chat, Alyssa left a link to provide feedback on today's session. We appreciate your feedback. So without any further ado, thank you all. Thank you for attending, and thank you to the panel. Have a good afternoon, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.